let's talk about the economy. One of the things that some Trump supporters are willing to acknowledge is that Trump is making some strategically negative decisions in the final stretch of this election. The way that he attacks Kamala Harris personally, the way that he focuses and fixates on the most bizarre of things at his rallies, that's not really serving his campaign much, especially when, as like I said, some MAGA people will acknowledge there are other issues that especially they believe would be advantageous for Trump to put all the emphasis on. One of them being the economy. They say if Trump could just focus on the economy, and not Kamala Harris's race or whatever it might be, then he'd definitely win the election. And what's interesting is, if I'm being honest, maybe that's true. If Trump would stop being such a mess, he could win this election. He could even win it being a mess, is the scary part. But he could have a better chance of winning if he could continue operating on a foundation of nonsense information that people are getting about the economy and the border and crime and all these different things. And that's what I want to explore here on the economy. The whole premise of the pro-Trump economic argument, especially the premise of the contrast argument between Trump and Biden-Harris, is completely based on a false and inaccurate standard, and an unequal standard, to say the least, being applied. And Andrew Ross Sorkin on CNBC, just through a simple line of questioning, exposed that with Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin in a beautiful fashion. Let's discuss after this. While you're watching the clip, please make sure you've clicked the subscribe button if you haven't already.
Things. They projected that we would have a recession in the last year. We didn't. They projected that inflation would go up during the Trump administration because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and it went down. I think we have to look at the real track records, and Americans feel that. And that's why even just yesterday, there was a very good poll that said that on a factor of 9, Americans trust Donald Trump with the economy and not Kamala Harris.
The thing that I don't understand about this idea of, like, let's just look at the track records of both and to compare them. The truth is, and I'm going to try to be somewhat objective about this, you may disagree, I actually think you really can't compare either of them. I think they're almost not comparable, not because of anything else except that in the middle of this whole thing is a pandemic. And prior to Trump getting in office, there was coming out of a whole period of time, and now coming out of the pandemic on the other side, that it's because if I were to go apples to apples, right, and include the pandemic, which I assume you would actually have to, you would claim you want to take out, because otherwise I tell you that, you know, he lost all these jobs, and you'd say, well, there's a pandemic.
Well,
right?
And inflation was up in the Trump administration over Obama.
On either side, though. Remember that, remember that job growth that has been claimed by the Biden administration, a lot of that is bounce back jobs.
Well, but this is why I'm saying that this idea of sitting.
Yes, that's the thing. First of all, no, it's not. We've talked before about how you have what you could describe as bounce back jobs. And then above that, way more. And this represents, if you compare this to the pre-pandemic numbers for Trump, still stronger job growth than Trump was experiencing when he had a good economy handed to him. Biden had a bad economy handed to him.
Of saying, well, look, you know, one view of the world was so much better than the other, or one or another was better than, it doesn't make sense in a way.
Well, I think
do you agree with that?
I think no.
Let's just try to be.
Yeah, no, I think it does make sense, because what we have to inject in this is the reality of on the ground.
Right,
what are people feeling?
Right, but we don't know if President Trump had been the president.
Right, and goes on to make some fantastic points. I'll stop it there. But that's Glenn Youngkin admitting defeat. It is. When you can't argue on the big picture, stat, data-based points, and you have to just reduce your argument to, I'm just going off of how people feel on the ground. I care about how people feel on the ground, but feelings can be both manipulated, and feelings can then justify false conclusions about why people are feeling that way. So here, if you're a viewer of the show, if you're part of the Beasley Brigade and you've heard this rant over and over, this isn't breaking news to you, but what's stunning and why I find that clip so remarkable is mainstream media does not emphasize that ridiculous double standard enough. They barely do, to be frank. Which is that the whole Trump economic argument assumes that you're willing to exclude from Trump's record the pandemic, but include the pandemic in Biden-Harris's record. Meaning, I'm going to cite stats, if I were MAGA, that analyze the first 3 years of Trump's presidency and say, look at his economic performance. Also not including how that was inherited from Obama, but we won't get into that again. But then they'll include stats with Biden-Harris that are obviously impacted, like inflation, by the pandemic conditions. Or gas prices obviously impacted by a decision Trump made, a deal he negotiated with Saudi Arabia and Russia to protect oil companies to massively, at an unprecedented level, cut oil production. So then demand shot back up eventually, and production wasn't matching it. But then we blame Biden-Harris because they were in power. With no understanding of the world, time didn't begin with Biden-Harris. Time also didn't begin with Trump, which is why you should include the recovery that Obama oversaw when understanding and trying to analyze the claims Trump makes about his economic performance. So then Glenn Youngkin gets confronted with that. And what does he have? Oh, well, people feel. They feel on the ground this or that. Well, first of all, not everyone. The belief or the positivity about the economy has been increasing with consumer sentiment. But it's sort of like what we talk about with the election. If you convince people that the election was stolen, you can't then come to me and say, well, you can't say it's crazy to believe that because a lot of people believe it. Well, you convinced them of it. It's a little different with this because we're talking about real economic pain, but then you're convincing them they should feel like that pain is because of the Inflation Reduction Act or an infrastructure law that caused inflation, according to you, when in reality, it's a far more complex picture. And so if you want to be honest, you analyze all of it. You analyze Trump's handling of the pandemic that was disastrous, deals like the one I just mentioned that contributed to inflation, the exacerbated economic pain because of his mismanaging, the exacerbated crime spike because of his mismanaging, the exacerbated public health crisis because of his mismanaging. And then you look at Biden-Harris and you say, all right, here's what they were handed. Here are problems, if you're being honest with yourself, that while they definitely could have impacted and I'm sure made mistakes in how they handled it, I can't blame the whole problem on them if it predated them or if the underlying causes did at least. And so how did they handle those issues that were inherited? And that's where you get into the analysis of look at how our economy recovered compared to everyone else on the planet. Look at how our economy recovered compared to past recoveries the United States has experienced, etc. And those facts, if people really engaged with them, I think would lead a lot of people to understand it. Just like how if you engage with the data on the last century of economic performance, you come to the conclusion that, oh, Democrats by a massive margin oversee better economic performance. Maybe if I care a lot about economic performance, I vote for this party over the other. The same conclusion should be come to about Harris, Trump, if the world made sense. Here's Andrew Ross Sorkin confronting Tim Scott on CNBC as we reviewed about this as well.
People working paycheck to paycheck.
Are you a free trader, Senator? Do you
Absolutely.
agree with all the tariffs? Do you think John Deere 200%?
Listen,
do you think companies that make stuff here should be a 15% tax? That's industrial policy, isn't it?
I believe that President Trump oftentimes talks in the abstract.
Okay.
Number one. Number two, I do believe that we have to find
So what are we supposed to believe then?
Well, listen, let's believe his performance. Believe what we saw for 2017 to 2020. Well, let me finish because you asked a good question. What should we believe? We should believe that a 21%, reducing the taxes from 35 to 21%, repatriated almost $2 trillion from around the world, bringing it home. We should believe the 7 million jobs that he created, and 2/3 of those jobs went to African Americans, Hispanics, Hispanics, and
you a
women.
question, though?
We should
That
actually
okay,
believe
here's the
in what he
question.
produced. Yes,
That excludes,
100%.
obviously, that excludes COVID, right? Part of what you're saying is we should sort of take this timeout period around COVID and not include that in
That's not what I'm saying at all. I would actually say that if you look at COVID itself specifically, they said that you couldn't get a vaccine in 10 years or 5 years.
No,
he did it in
I'm
9
saying
months.
on the economic numbers. And the reason I'm raising this is because when we try to do an apples to apples between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, invariably what we hear is, look at all of the economic growth during the Trump administration. But by the way, please don't look at the last year and then look at how terrible we say that the Biden administration did on a relative basis. But by the way, please don't even contemplate the idea that anything happened before that as it relates to COVID, right?
Let us ask the American people, are they better off now than they were 4 years ago? The answer is emphatically no. Why? Because when the average family is spending $1,000, $1,075 and lost spending power, of course you're not better off. When gas is up 50% more than the last month.
And why do you think that was?
Well, obviously, there's two reasons. Number one, the reasons why the average American family has less spending power today than they did beforehand was because of first vote, the Democrats.
Yeah, so it's the same general argument. He goes back to, well, ask people. But many of the people that you're talking about either are engaging with what I'm laying out here, or, hate to say it, as real as their economic feelings are, their feelings about where the causes of those things come from are a product of a big multi-billion-dollar machine, this right-wing media machine, and then a big machine that fails to counter that, mainstream liberal media that doesn't talk about what we are enough, leading to people thinking something that's not aligned with the data on this, and leading to a collective amnesia that is hard to deal with on a daily basis, because it's people going, oh yes, I wish we could just go back to 4 years ago. 4 years ago? In the midst of the worst public health crisis in a generation? You want to go back to there? Oh, well, okay, well, I mean, before that. But it was under Trump. Well, of course, before this global crisis, of course we want to go back to an economy that had recovered from the Great Recession, mostly under Obama, before dealing with all the problems that to this day we're still trying to fully address. Yeah, but that's not a Trump thing. That's just the pandemic was terrible thing. And Tim Scott does the same thing. Well, let's just talk to people then. After you convince them of it. No, ridiculous. And my hope is, if enough people really critically engaged, wherever they sit politically, with what we've now been talking about and sometimes shouting about for a couple of years, they'd come to a similar conclusion because it's so overwhelmingly backed up by the evidence. It's really hard to cite contextualized metrics that prove Biden-Harris mismanaged the recovery. Truly. We just talked about the real, adjusted for inflation, wage growth. Now compared to this time after an economic recession in past historical examples. Just another data point with all the others that demonstrate what I'm talking about. So, if one question about a fundamental double standard throws you off that much, as we saw with Youngkin and Tim Scott, maybe your argument is weak. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Support the show by clicking the join button below.